Hello and welcome to the People, Place and Nature podcast. A really interesting discussion today on everything sustainability with our fantastic guest, Dr. Ollie Jones. Ollie's the co-host of the FutureX podcast and Associate Director for Sustainability and Innovation for Cundall, a global multidisciplinary engineering firm. We talk a bit about everything from what Cundall was doing regarding sustainability, as well as more generally regarding the state of our professions, the challenges they face, new technologies and other issues too, and things that have cropped up across the various podcasts we're both involved with. So a big thank you to Ollie for his time, and I hope you find this episode as interesting as I did. I hope you've enjoyed the episode so far. Here's a quick message from one of our sponsors. Make sustainability a priority throughout the design process with a suite of tools built specifically for landscape architecture and design. Vectorworks gives you the freedom to follow your imagination wherever it may lead, with remarkably flexible software that integrates BIM for landscape and GIS workflows. Sketch, model, and document in a single tool with the world's most design-centric BIM solution. Discover Vectorworks' landmark and design without limits. Visit vectorworks.net to learn more. Hello, Ollie. Thank you for joining us. Fantastic to have you here today. We're going to be talking about all sorts of things to do with sort of architecture, engineering, sustainability, some of the sort of general problems we're facing when it comes to the environmental world and how we get the transition that we want to a more sustainable future. So thanks again for joining us and lovely to see you in person.
Mate, thank you very much for the invite. And, you know, I've watched from afar, I've seen the podcasts and the videos online, and I'm a massive fan. So it's a total privilege to be having a chat with you in person as well. Yeah, thank you. And where do you want to start?
Well, I think we could probably start talking a bit about sustainable cities. I think that's something that we're both sort of doing quite a lot of work on, trying to understand what we can actually do. So maybe talk a bit about your work that you've been doing there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've recently transitioned from a research director role in architectural practice to a head of sustainability role in engineering practice. And I think the key to that was really to just be a bit closer to some of the big sustainability impacts and being able to have an impact and really sort of push forward that sustainability agenda, not just at a building scale, but at a city scale. And, you know, you're right in mentioning this idea around sustainable cities, because I think there's so much that we need to focus on in terms of that collective decision making at a local authority level. But it becomes a lot more around relationships. It becomes a lot more around things that I know you talk about quite a lot around energy neutrality, but also those complex energy networks within cities. How do we move towards whole city retrofit? So there's so much to unpack there. So it's just, where do you want to start?
Well, should we start with the retrofitting side? Yeah. Because I know that that's something really, you know, close to your heart and something you're trying to get, you know, and do a lot of work on. So maybe we can talk a bit about that.
So I mean, in terms of whole city retrofit, I think that this is an unbelievable moment in terms of our industry and our sector. We've got this opportunity to transition into what essentially is going to be business as normal in 20 years' time. You know, there's going to be practices and businesses picking up new builds and the design of whole new cities. But in reality, 80 to 90% of everything that's already built and that we need is already built. So it's what do we do with it and how do we start to manage it and transition those assets into decarbonising them. And I think part of that process is fundamentally changing the way we value those assets. And it's something that I've spoken in the past to many people. One who I hold in particularly high regard, Indy Johar from Dark Matter Labs, around how do you value an asset? And it can't just be related to the land value of an asset anymore. In fact, that's becoming increasingly irrelevant as a measure of value. It's more about how much carbon is locked up in that asset. Is that asset a carbon treasury? Can you look at that asset in terms of having a whole new financial and economic model around it because it has carbon locked up in it? And then there's other things, you know, that buildings do amazing things for people in cities. You know, they are the hubs of the way we live. They are of where we play, of where we work. And as a consequence, they have a lot of social value and social impact attached to them as well. Well, how do we start monetizing that? How do we start to look at, well, this asset here actually has a carbon treasury rating of X. It actually delivers X amount of social impact and social value to the community. Because I'm adamant, if we really valued assets and looked at the true value of assets across that holistic scale, not only would we have much more resilient energy structures, but we would make healthcare savings, and we probably wouldn't be closing half as many public libraries or swimming pools or community assets as we currently do.
No, I completely agree. I think one of the big problems I kind of observe with sort of high streets in decline, and when you start thinking about that side of things too, they always kind of were more, well, they were necessary because everything was there. You had to go to them to do your shopping or whatever, whereas now everything's online. But it's not even just the online side that seems to be a problem. It's kind of how do we rethink how we're actually approaching town. So I'm from Basingstoke originally, and I know they're planning a large sort of edge of town sort of retail park. And you think, okay, one, do we really need it? Because actually all of these shops are sort of struggling in the city centre. And actually that's going to potentially help kill the city centre off, because you're going to divert even more people away from that. But then generally, what is the purpose of the city centre? Because it's not, its current or historic purpose has been shopping, but actually really now it needs to become a hub, a community hub really. And how do you reframe that and make that accessible and give as much back to people as possible? So it becomes not just the city centre, but how do people get there? How is it going to be managed? What resources and things are going to be there for them to access, like libraries or swimming pools or whatever? And you start then thinking, actually, we need more active travel routes to support that transition and all of these things too. So sometimes when you look at these things, it can go a bit beyond kind of just that thing that is happening there. And it's that bigger picture or strategy that kind of needs to be addressed as well.
It always makes me laugh. So we'll come on to this idea that I've talked to you about in the past around this 100-year plan. But it always makes me laugh that we've got all of these things at play now. So we've got social value, we've got retrofit, we've got decarbonisation, we've got energy structures and systems in place. All of these things, and we've set people off, we've set departments off, we set government officials, local authority officials, all running in these different directions. And at some point, somewhere, somebody is going to have the task of bringing them back together.
Absolutely.
And my big sell on this is actually just hang on a minute. Let's just have a conversation about value-based decision making for that area, for that location, and that's when we come into that idea about the 100-year plan. But before that, I think in terms of industry, there's an idea that's always been around, but is not always adhered to, which is around how could we move towards an intelligent approach to master planning, to placemaking, to landscaping. And that's by really looking at all of the data sets that we have at our hands. If anything, data and the digital world around us has advanced to such a degree now that we've got an unbelievable amount of opportunity to interpret, to analyze, to forecast different events. And I'm seeing people, or I was seeing people make some really unusual decisions around the removal of sustainable drainage systems in favor of additional development of undercroft car parking. The removal of things that actually, given what's happened with the likes of Grenfell, and we've got a watershed moment there where people have come calling 20 odd years later to say, you made decisions, you had the information to hand, and you made decisions to make the wrong call at that time. So we're here for the reparations.
Yeah.
And we're doing that in terms of thinking about, well, surface water management. How is that happening now, and what's happening with regards to that? You take that sustainable drainage system out, that local authority is probably going to have to pay another 8 million over the course of 5 years, 10 million potentially. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for a layered approach to master planning and understanding there's different levels of data and intelligence. It might be demographic, it might be environmental, it could be around air quality. I think when you take an intelligent approach to master planning, you've got an opportunity to sit with a client, sit with a local authority and say, what are your priorities? Are they around social mobility? Are they around the social value stuff? Are they around inclusivity, equity and diversity? Are they around air quality or water quality or the land quality and how we're developing our land? Are they around biodiversity and net gain? If you have a conversation with the local authority or the big overarching landowner or estate owner at the time and get them to prioritize those needs and wants and say, look, all of these are important to us, but we're going to start here. We've got an amazingly rich tapestry of data to hand now where we can start making some really interesting decisions that say, This is how we are going to bring people back into our urban centres. You talk about the high streets and the issues with the high streets. I think there's an opportunity, and I've always been of this mindset that nature-based design interventions, the revival of the sort of green corridors, but with far more meaning, connecting our suburban areas back into the urban centre, particularly post-COVID with high-quality green space. There's a massive opportunity to drive people back into the urban centres, to address public health, to address air quality, to link schools with a much richer form of education. Why don't we use green infrastructure to connect all of our schools with our cultural assets and our heritage assets? Because those assets tend to have problems with footfall and engagement, and have money that they put into schools activities all of the time. So where's the joined up thinking? I guess that's my big play, is where's the joined up thinking?
Yeah, well, this is exactly it. I think it's when you start looking at it this way, you see that actually we have very linear thinking or two-dimensional thinking. And the way I see it, there's sort of two problems. One is that it's a sort of multifunctional space side of it, because even projects that I'm involved with now, we're working with councils or whoever else where they don't have that sort of hierarchy as you discussed. Okay, that's the first problem, I suppose, is the hierarchy's not necessarily there in terms of what they want. Yeah. So we regularly design sort of public realm enhancements, and then immediately you get the safety officer come in and say, well, you can't have benches, people might sit there, and then we don't want people sitting there. And you think, well, but then at the same time, you've got a target for inclusivity and accessibility. And then we're in the next breath, we're designing sustainable urban drainage systems to move people away from roads so it's safer, they're not as close to cars, it's intercepting air pollution, cleaning the water. Yeah. Oh, but hang on a minute, everyone walks next to the road here and that's what they've always done. Okay, but that's not really a very good argument. And we don't want to have to manage that. Okay, well, you're going to have to learn to start managing it, because we know we need these systems in and we know they're more cost effective and better long-term solutions than the traditional way of managing drainage, for instance.
Well, it's probably an overused word, isn't it? But it's a true approach to sustainability.
Yeah.
It's a sustainable approach to a much more sustainable environment. And that, for me, that was the thing that drew me towards this idea around value-based decision-making, which is that it's a totally transparent process of sitting with a client or a local authority and saying, look, we have collectively agreed and co-owned the development of this document or framework that says this is how we're going to make decisions. So that you don't have the person who's in charge of ticking off those benches, or you have the ability to rebut and say, actually, the local authority is committed to a climate emergency or an ecological emergency or both. And we've agreed that we are going to first and foremost tackle air quality.
Yeah.
And then we're going to tackle social cohesion and inequality. So that's why we're making these decisions. So while your opinion about the placement of these chairs is important, it's not as important as the priorities for the local authority.
That's it, absolutely. And I think there's a real decision-making issue within councils, which is a nightmare for developers. And it's something that's really got to be resolved to just help streamline things and get things moving more effectively, because these can hold things up for months and months and months. And often they're internal disputes. It's actually nothing to do with the development. It's an internal, as you say, decision on what should be done or needs to be done, and they can't make their mind up, so they just keep putting it back to you because the departments don't talk to each other. It's a real problem.
Well, and you get to the point as well where the political system changes. The people in power change. And in fairness to local authorities and local government, they've been cut to the bone year upon year upon year. And with the best will in the world, in a lot of instances, they're capability deprived. They've got one or two people who are incredibly passionate, really energetic, and really want to change the region and the city that they live in. But how do you do that when you're almost a lone voice within the local authority? And you're also dealing with everybody else who wants to change things in a slightly different way. And I think this is where, I'd made the massive pitch to you about the 100-year plan and trying to push that and promote that a bit more.
Well, why don't you talk a bit more about that? Because I think it's the sort of thing we need. We need something beyond the norm. The way we've been doing things clearly hasn't been working,
Yeah.
or it worked for a time and we've reached the point where all of the tension points and points where these systems are starting to fray is really becoming obvious, and things are starting to break down, and the issues and the problems we're facing are really starting to manifest and become blindingly obvious to everybody. Like, look at the floods we're having, very intense rainfall, longer periods of drought. That's just the water side, let alone everything else, the public health impact of heat stress and all these things too. We've got to do something about it now, and we've got to understand, well, we already know where it's going. We need to plan well ahead for how do we get to the point to deal with that, as you say, in 100 years' time. What's it going to be like in 100 years? How do we mitigate that and put all of those processes in place to deliver it now?
My big concern is that I honestly, truly, hand on heart, think if we are going to have this massive impact and achieve this huge ambition to reach a net zero 2050, the Paris Agreement, even do it by 2040, and in most cases when businesses and local authorities have committed, do it by 2030. So there's a lot of big commitments out there, there's a lot of big ambition. But in order to meet that, things need to change quite dramatically. We need some really bold moves, we need some massive investment, and we need some incredible vision that comes out of it. And I'm not seeing that from a lot of places. There's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of local government and government looking towards industry. How are we going to attract more investment? How are we going to do the things that we've always done, but do them a little bit faster? And then from industry, there's also looking back at government saying, well, we're waiting for the roadmaps, we're waiting for the standards, the certification, the compliance. And I honestly believe there's a bit more of a proactive step change that needs to happen in between there. And the key problem with it for me is that things very quickly tend to become quite normal. So, I'm talking at a family level, at a community level. I'm from the Northeast. I'm sat there, it's 40 degrees on a summer's day. When I was growing up, there was no danger in this world that Newcastle was ever going to be 40 degrees on a summer's day. I would have said you were mad if you'd told me that. And then only last month, there was a wildfire in the northeast of England. Again, somebody told me we were going to have wildfires that fundamentally affected the air quality of the city. There was an incredibly pungent, massive particulate matter bomb that took over the entire city centre because of the wildfires that were happening in the north of England. Because this stuff happens and is happening with such regularity, such frequency in our news cycles, I think we start to become either numb to it or familiar with it, and it's just another thing. Oh yeah, not another heat wave, or not another 40-degree week, or not another pollen bomb or a wildfire. And in reality, what we need to do is have some incredibly ambitious political leadership and industry leadership that starts to pave the way. And I think the only way to do that is to stop looking at short-term political cycles. So the only conclusion that I'm sort of toying with and have been speaking to a number of local authorities about is local authorities are at the heart of this in my mind, because it's all about communities, it's all about economic regeneration, it's all about public health. But then there's this big thing about environmental health. And these guys are strapped for capability, for cash, for resource. So let's make it easy. Let's say, well, all of the environmental decision making, let's just take that off your hands. And you become a part of that decision making. You don't get to change it every 4 to 5 years and reinvent it and not achieve that massive vision that was set out in the campaign that you run to take leadership. And maybe let's take public health away as well. Because for me, for environmental health and public health, there's only really one answer. There's only really one right answer, one right approach to make both things work. Form an all-party parliamentary local group that starts to plan a 100-year vision for a region that is beyond our lifetimes as individuals, as people, as practitioners, as politicians. And then if you're in power in the local government, you're the steward of that delivery of that plan. And you can change it, but you have to convene that group, that wider group again, because one of the most detrimental things, I think, to achieving a lot of these ambitions is that short-term political cycle that constantly means that we're revisiting budgets, pots of money. There isn't a long-term investment plan. And we've seen it work in some really good places. You know, we're in Manchester today. Manchester has got an incredibly cohesive combined authority. It's articulated a really clear vision for the future. I don't think it's a 100-year vision. It should be. It's articulated a really clear vision for the future. And that's driven investment into the city. So that's what brings the money. That's what brings the big business.
Yeah, it's stability, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's the finance. That's the golden key that we've been looking for to unlock all of this new stuff that we need to do to address the climate emergency. Is how do we attract people back to this city? How do we attract investment back to this city? You have a cohesive, workable, but incredibly clear and ambitious plan for what the region and the city are going to become. And I honestly, hand on heart, haven't seen that anywhere outside of London in the UK.
No, I agree. I think there's a lot of people talking about what they want to do and banding around, you know, new titles or designations or whatever it may be for cities. But actually, what do they mean, I think? And as you say, it comes back to sort of these roadmaps and actually what are we driving forward? But then the question is, how do you actually implement that? And what sort of policies and things are going to come from it? But if you don't have that strong sort of stability, which is going to encourage economic growth, you easily have something that everyone can start rebutting or questioning. So getting that in place first is really important.
Well, and designing it together, you know, like co-developing it and co-designing it. And it has a compound effect on innovation in the region as well.
Absolutely.
And businesses that are developing solutions, because as a business owner, you'll be, you know, right, do you know what?
Well, you'll be keen to go, we'll set up an office there because that's going to be integral.
We'll set up
to
an
what
office,
we're doing.
we'll go to the bank and we'll get a loan because we're going to employ X amount of new people, we're going to develop X new services, because we have the confidence and we have the faith, not in the incumbent political party, but we have the faith in the region, in the communities, and in what's going on the ground, and that this area, this community has a real vision and a real passion to achieve something different. I think for too long, particularly as, you know, speaking as a member of the public, we expect government and local government to do a lot for us. And actually, we're now at the time where everybody has to chip in. There's an awful lot of people that have the ability to make incredibly bold commitments and to climate change and sustainable choices, lifestyle choices, but they don't want to feel like they're doing it alone. So how do we start to engender that? How do we push a massive active travel push across the region? How do we articulate the true economic benefits and impact of this on a region? And I'm really interested in that economic argument in terms of what is the real argument here in terms of the economic impact that this is having? Because all too often it comes down to, those sustainable moves and interventions are just too expensive in terms of capital expenditure.
Well, again, it's the long-term view. So we are involved in a project where we're advising the Prince's Trust, and some of the discussions coming out of those discussions are things like we have to reevaluate the mortgage market, for instance, because obviously they take into account affordability in terms of what you can afford, but that doesn't take into account necessarily the running costs of properties that are much, much more efficient. So actually, why isn't that the case? It should be blindingly obvious that's something we should do. And that's going to help make those properties, okay, they may be more expensive, but they're more affordable because you don't have those ongoing costs. So that should be factored in, which will help encourage a shift, because developers will be able to implement those solutions and then still sell those properties to people that can actually afford them. And if anything, there'll be more people are more incentivized to buy them because their outlays are less later on. So there's lots of those kind of things where they're relatively, it's a simple example, but there's a lot of that kind of thing that needs to take place. And I think from industry, there is a huge appetite for finding places that are supportive. So I've also just come back from a trip to Singapore where we were there as a startup, talking with other startups and in the city and looking at what they're doing. And there's a massive appetite there because they're trying to, really set themselves apart as leaders in net zero and environmental strategy. And they're doing a lot in terms of public health and stuff around the city and greening it and all of these kind of things. And they're massively constrained because they're a small island nation, basically. Island city, really. So they're much more at the forefront of having to tackle these problems than many other places. But it being there, you can clearly see that everybody is behind the vision. It doesn't matter who you talk to in the city, they get it, and they're committed to trying to take this thing forward. And it encourages people, and people want to invest there because they want to be seen to be part of that journey.
It's not this. What's happening at the moment with the Green Revolution is not. It's nothing we've seen even in previous eras of an industrial revolution or a technology revolution. The level of disruption is yes, it's very similar. But actually, the difference is that we don't have time for industry to gear up, for business as usual to peter out and slightly change its ways and slowly evolve. Because we've got the hard stop of rising sea temperatures, rising land temperatures, heat dome effect, unprecedented levels of flooding, UK wildfires. I'm not one to be talking about those sort of doomsday events, but they're clearly here. Globally, and we need to fundamentally change how we do business. We need to fundamentally change how we run our cities. We need to fundamentally change the policies, the local policies at local government level, in order for each region to become more resilient and to really embed that future adaptation plan. Because there's no point in saying, well, this transition is going to take 27, 30 years, when in reality, we don't really have that long, because our city centre environments are going to continue creeping up in temperature. You may get people moving to cooler areas. You may get people choosing to live in different ways. There's a lot of unknown variables. I think the risk, the economic risk and the public health risk and the environmental risk is far, far greater than committing a massive expenditure at the moment, a massive amount of capital at the minute, to fix this problem. And I actually think if we do that right now, we're going to unlock so many other added benefits that we won't realize if we wait too long. If we totally back all of the stuff that you guys are involved with around sort of green infrastructure and greening cities, then we're going to see compound benefits in external air quality, in public health, in a reduction in respiratory diseases. We're going to see a reduction if we address heat and ventilation and overheating in homes. We're going to see a reduction in damp and mold instances in homes, which by the way, in the UK, 12, 24 months ago, was accountable for over 500,000 days off school. Now, there's not only an effect there for students going forward, but that's also at least 500,000 work days of an adult needed to come out of work to take that child out of school. So there's all of these added benefits, and what I really want is that holistic view of data, that understanding of the economic impact, to better articulate just why we have to be greening our towns and cities at a rate of knots yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other way to look at it as well, the other thing that I'm sort of seeing is there's the emerging sort of, well, not emerging, as you said, they're here already, and we can, hopefully everyone can clearly see the environmental catastrophes that sort of emerging around us and are becoming much more frequent and intense. But also there's that side, but then there's also kind of the growth of everything that's happening, at least in the UK. It's not happening everywhere, but we've got a huge growth of our cities and population rise and everything. And that's putting a massive strain on all of our existing infrastructure.
Yep.
Now, economically, we can't carry on or upgrade that because it's just too expensive. There's already talk in some regions about us having to replace whole sections of the grid, which is just foolish and incredibly expensive. So actually the solution is an incredibly sustainable, resilient microgrid or something like that. And you start thinking, why are we even considering replacing the grid? What we should be doing is saying, right, as a policy now, going forward, all the new developments are going to be retrofitted, or not necessarily retrofitted, but built with this in mind, or that can help facilitate through like neutrality strategy or whatever, nearby developments or existing properties into that same resilient grid.
Well, look, is anybody happening? Is anybody content with the way that our energy system works?
I think no.
It's clearly a broken market.
Yeah.
And absolutely. Actually, there has to come a time when we have the governmental leadership and foresight to say, look, we need a fundamental rethink on the way this works. There's an opportunity here. It's not going to get much more broken than it currently is.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've always been of the belief of the last sort of 5 to 10 years, having met some extraordinary people in the energy space, that why are we trying to breathe additional life into the national grid when there is a massive opportunity to increase not only local resilience, but the country's general energy market resilience by embracing
I completely agree.
microgrids.
Yeah, and I think as well, energy is such a fantastic one to use as an example, but it applies to really all of the resources and things that we need. When you start looking at it, I found myself now more and more saying to politicians or specialists, whoever it may be I'm talking to, saying, forget the environmental side, right? We all know that the environmental side is really important. How are you going to afford to retrofit this? The solution is this much more sustainable model. Just economically. But then when you factor in other considerations like security, which we know now is a huge risk, there's already been reports of, subs and things assessing undersea power lines and all of this kind of thing around the world. Okay, we still need to put those renewable solutions in, and we should do, that's the right thing to do. But actually, what more resilience can be built in? Oh, well, the best way to make it resilient is also to have microgrids. So you start going, well, we know there's an obvious and massive environmental benefit, and it's what we should be doing environmentally. Economically, it makes sense, and security-wise, it makes sense. So surely, this is the way we should all be coming at it. But the problem is, as you said, well, as we said right at the beginning, because you've got this sort of fragmented system of people working in silos, they don't look at it that way. Okay, yeah, this makes sense, but I'm not interested in the environmental bit because I'm just dealing with the infrastructure or the energy production. And it's like, well, really, you should be looking at it sort of end to end. And we need that sort of end-to-end view of how to deliver these strategies.
You always fall into the habit of talking to these people in the language that they understand. And you look at any successful company on this planet, and let's compare it to how the government works. It is the leader's remit to set and articulate an incredibly clear, ambitious vision that is achievable and that has a plan as to how it's going to be achieved. But the next sort of golden rule down the line is don't try and do it all yourself. And this is my argument for not having a centralized approach. You need to delegate. You need to delegate the responsibility for energy security out to the regions. You need to delegate the responsibility for energy security at a regional level out to the communities. And for me, that idea around decentralized energy is an absolute no-brainer. I'm often taken the task when I say, well, I think energy should be free. I think energy should be free for the people who are in fuel poverty. But actually, nothing can be free. There's always a cost in terms of its administration, its development. But it should be run at a community level, and it should be based on being able to have that really resilient, incredibly renewable microgrid.
Well, it goes back to what does resilient kind of mean as well, which I think a lot of people get confused by, because people will say resilient and they think, oh, okay, it's protected from outside intervention or more robust. Oh, okay, it's better environmentally. But again, the economic resilience doesn't necessarily have to be in the context of separating it from the wider grid or the grid upgrades, but it's that economic resilience of the local community. Solar is a good example. You'll have lots of providers and people maintaining solar locally, opposed to large regional companies or centralized companies, as you say. So you're building a much more resilient local economy that's maintaining infrastructure in perpetuity, essentially.
And it's understanding the local market. So there's a lot of the work I do is around advanced materials, and there is a phenomenal company that's backed by Microsoft and Amazon and the Googles of this world, that spun out of Canada, called Carbon Cure. And Carbon Cure essentially takes food grade waste CO2 and injects it into concrete as a cementitious replacement to speed up the curing of the concrete. It'll typically lower the embodied carbon concrete between 6 to 8% when it's used on a job. You say, well, let's use that in the UK market. There is no resilience, if we take just a step back, for additional food grade CO2 in the UK market. There's one place that predominantly produces most of the UK's food grade CO2, which is a plant in Teesside. And we had a huge panic across the UK when we realised, 3 years ago now, that there was an issue with that plant, there was a funding issue with it, and they were going to close. And then that had a massive knock-on effect downstream to fizzy drinks, how we are storing meat, all these additional unintended consequences around. You don't understand the resilience, the wider resilience of some of these key parts of just the way we live. And I think the reason why I mention that is because the issues that we're seeing around the energy crisis at the moment, there's so many compound effects that come from that. And I think I keep saying this word compound effects, but I think we need to understand that we're in such a disrupted time at the moment that one thing piling on top of another thing is always going to have another set of effects that just spring out from it. So, we've got the fuel crisis, we've got the energy crisis, but that's having a part to play in the cost of living crisis. But then we've got an issue with the fact that the energy crisis is having a knock-on effect with how costly and expensive it is, and food prices have inflated by over 18%. So there's all of this sort of domino effect that's already starting to happen. We're on the brink in this country of a water crisis, which is madness.
Yeah. Exactly. And people I think with a lot of these things, people aren't necessarily aware of just how bad some of these problems are. Because you think the UK, we're pretty resilient. You can go down to the river and see that the river's still full of water and you think, oh yeah, great, that's not too bad. But now we're starting to see, even though the river's full of water, it's heavily polluted. Yeah. The fish are starting to die. There's more and more algal blooms taking place. So even though there is water, there's huge contamination issues across the UK. Now rivers are really in a terrible situation. And I was listening to I think it was BBC Radio 4 recently, where they were talking to a specialist on that. And they were saying, the water companies were saying, well, actually, it is technically clean because that's the current requirement for what clean is. But then the campaigners were sort of saying, well, surely then you need to change what the definition of clean is, because even though it's for you clean, it's clearly having a major impact on the rivers. And it kind of goes back to some of those bigger issues around that, that it's the law of unintended consequences and issues compounding. It's been fine for a long time, but now we're reaching the point where the capacity of these systems to take that has reached its point where it can no longer manage.
Look, we keep dripping into sort of that doomsday message.
Yeah.
But there is a real highlight to this, which is that there's an unbelievable amount of energy, there's an unbelievable amount of action. But what it lacks at the moment is real, genuine leadership and genuine vision to help guide that leadership, and understanding how we make decisions on a day-to-day basis as a business, as a government, as a huge multinational organization that will deliver the most value. Because every pound or dollar that we spend now has to have an unbelievable amount of value across the board. It has to tick biodiversity. It has to sort out some elements of social injustice. It has to contribute to cleaner air or cleaner water. And I think, but make no mistake about it, I think we are fundamentally living through a breakdown at this very moment in time, a catastrophic breakdown of ecological systems. You've got the world's largest seaweed mound moving across the ocean and due to wash up on our shores shortly. You've got algal blooms happening at a rate of knots across bodies of water. It doesn't take a lot for an algal bloom to totally destroy any life within that water body. So, and then we've also got, as you've said, this issue with our rivers at the moment. So we need some absolutely huge action, some really radical action very quickly. And I think we need to fall back on what we're good at, which is working with one another, which is talking and coming up with really genuinely plans that benefit one another and that are open and transparent about the way that we're making decisions. And please don't leave it up to one person to make those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing is as well with all of this, we've got most of the solutions, the technologies or the policy examples or whatever else it may be that we know can deliver it. It just needs that impetus and, as you say, those decisions to be made. And I think they do have to be made more at a local level based on Well, because those local people can see the local issues clearly, whereas from central government perspective, it's much more difficult to. I think there does need to be a much more sort of delegation of power to be able to tackle them, to just move things along. We found this week Cambridgeshire, it was even yesterday, Cambridgeshire have now refused 5,000 new homes to be built because there's not enough water. These things are going to start happening more and more and more and more. And it's happening now. These are not problems for 50 years. These are problems right now. So we need to start implementing these solutions to be able to continue to have the economic development and quality of life and everything that we want. That's a massive problem for the housing crisis that we already have. It's just going to get worse because.
And I guess that's my challenge for the next government is how are you going to support an unbelievably innovative transition into a whole new set of economies that are emerging economies that are within our grasp right now. So, there's some fantastic examples that are coming out. Yorkshire, North Yorkshire Local Enterprise Partnership have commissioned a phenomenal piece of work around the circular economy and understanding the bioeconomy in that space. It's really quite. There's a lot of foresight that's gone into this. And there's 40 of the 44 hemp producers that are in Yorkshire. So you start to get this really interesting regional makeup across the UK where, it might be a bit like York Stone, that actually there's a bit of a revival in hempcrete and hemp construction because there's such a predominance of the manufacturing industry there is about bio-based materials and nature and using natural materials like hemp. But there's no reason why we can't have other emerging economic models around circularity and around particularly biocircularity, which I'm really passionate about. We've done an amazing amount of work with a lab in Sydney called the Deep Green Biotech Hub. And there's a phenomenal technology. It's already proven. It's not scaled to the level that we need it to be scaled at, but that's because of a number of different political and economic levers that need sorting out. But these guys are essentially 200 of the most intelligent marine biologists that you've ever come across. And you're like, well, why is someone in construction talking to marine biologists? Because these guys are really focused on one thing, which is the development of something called a bioreactor. And this bioreactor is a massive, think of a shipping container at the minute. It's called the Green Genie. I love this thing. It's on Jones Street in Sydney. There's no link to me there. I often joke with Peter that it was a homage. A bioreactor sucks in dirty air. And if you get the right strain of algae, which is what these incredibly intelligent people are working on, the algae then consumes all of the CO2 in the air. It also, interestingly, starts to eat all of the volatile organic compounds in the air, and it reproduces. So you end up with a high-value biomass, in this algal growth that you can harvest. So you've got super clean air coming out the other end. Typically, outdoor external air, if it's clean, is about 400 parts per million CO2. The air that's coming out of this bioreactor is 0 parts per million CO2. I've never breathed 0 parts per million CO2 air in my life. I don't think anybody has, unless you're on the other end of the Green Genie in Jones Street in Sydney. But the really exciting thing about this is not only have we come across a technology that will enable us to create cleaner air, to generate a whole new biomass product, it's also a really high value biomass product. We're not going to use it for fertilizer or for anything else. We can, but we're going to use it to create biofuels. It's already been used to create an aviation grade biofuel. And often when people say to me, how do you feel about working on an airport? Like, well, look, I don't have any problem with working on an airport because I don't think air travel is an unsolvable problem. In fact, it's already been solved. These guys have developed a aviation grade biofuel. It's been put into a passenger plane and the passenger plane has flown. The challenge and the problem is trying to break down existing incumbent energy companies and big oil companies to say you should really be paying to scale this amazing aviation biofuel. So for me, there's this unbelievable future that's within our grasp as the UK. We've got phenomenal science and engineering capabilities in this country to be able to say, well, let's really double down on the bioeconomy.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with you. We're actually also working with a company researching algae and biotech.
It's the next big thing
in Mexico, called ALIS, who we're hoping to have on the podcast at some point.
Yeah.
And they're looking at it from the water treatment side of things, and they're able to do some fantastic things with it. And again, biofuels. They're also looking at using it for, as you say, fertilizers. Now, fertilizers, as you said, it's not the most high value product. However, there is an opportunity to remove the requirement for petrochemical fertilizers,
which is much more resilient in our national production of fertilizer.
Exactly. It's much less likely to be heavily contaminating, like the current ones are. So, you start looking at things going, well, yeah, exactly. These solutions already exist. So why isn't there the investment or the scale up? And I know there have been some companies where I've looked at this where they found the trouble scaling it up economically, and that's been a problem. But we still know they work, and they're only going to become cheaper. The other one that I find really interesting, as you mentioned, sort of marine sciences. I met, I can't remember his name. I met a gentleman who wrote the book called Eat Like a Fish.
Right.
And he sort of developed some of the first big projects on ocean farming in the States. And they figured out that if they used 5% of US coastal waters, it could produce 50 million jobs in terms of managing of these farms. And all they are really, not to dumb it down, but all they are really is series of ropes and things with kelp and stuff seeded into it growing. But the fantastic thing about that is it sucks up huge amounts of carbon. Yeah. It's incredibly efficient. It's incredibly resilient because if a storm or something comes, you can lower the system because the storms predominantly are on the top of the sea. So it's incredibly resilient. There's no risk of drought because it's in the sea. So this crop can be produced all year. Has huge benefits in terms of storing carbon. It can be used to feed livestock, and some species reduce the methane produced by livestock. It means you don't then have to use as much farmland on land to produce the feed for those livestock, so it can be wild areas. And they did a study with the World Bank or the World Economic Forum, I can't remember who, and they found that if 7% of global coastal waters were used using this principle, it could replace the entire fossil fuel industry.
But that's you said you don't mean to dumb it down. I think that's part of the problem actually, is that a lot of these technologies where nature does the heavy lifting, they don't fit with our current commercial capitalist understanding of economic models of how to make money. So another fantastic technology which was totally my sweetheart technology before microalgae and macroalgae came along and knocked it off the top spot is mycelium. And understanding that actually, for the listeners that don't know what mycelium is it's the bit that grows when you're growing mushrooms. It's the root structure that grows before the mushroom sprouts. But what you can do with that is you can create a form of any kind. You can make it a brick, a block, a column. You can embed things in it. You fill that formwork with usually a biodegradable organic waste.
Like wood chips,
like wood chips or coffee grounds or other things. But they have now also found unbelievable mycelia that will consume plastics. So I know Biome, a company in this space, are doing a lot of work with Bupa to recycle their waste PPE. You fill this formwork with the waste stream. You inject the spores under sanitary conditions. It takes a very little amount of time to then consume all of that waste and form a really bulky mass of root network that's then baked at a low temperature so that it doesn't start making mushrooms. But this product, mycelium, has phenomenal acoustic properties, really good fire retardancy, really good thermal properties. It could be used in earthquake zones because it doesn't shear and break the way clay or brick does. It deforms, but has a lot of resilience in that deformation. So this is a wonder material. It totally deals with our waste. but there's nothing technologically, other than the science bit at the front and the lab bit during growing, in comparison to some of the technological processes that we've already got in play. It's not manufacturing as we know it.
Yeah.
Nature's doing all of the heavy lifting. And I think people are really struggling at a governmental and at a big business level to think, well, how the hell are we going to make really big profits on that? Because it's a really simple process and nature's doing most of the work for it. So
that's it.
There's a challenge there.
There is, but at the same time, I think it's, from an investor's point of view, you should be saying, well, we can do this way cheaper than everybody else and really sustainably. There's a fantastic case.
Well, and from a UK point of view,
and all this kind of thing.
We have a fundamentally fantastic scientific community.
Absolutely.
You know, unleash those minds on these mycelium space, on the algal space, and it just so happens that we're rather well surrounded by water.
Yeah.
Maybe not as much as we need in our lakes and reservoirs, but
beyond that,
beyond that,
there's loads.
Beyond that, we're not landlocked.
Yeah.
So we've got an unbelievable opportunity to totally, no pun intended, turn the tide on a net zero demise, as it might be seen, if we were to just embrace the science and the engineering behind biomaterials and the bioeconomy.
Well, there's an opportunity to lead the world because nobody else is at the moment. And it goes back to that sort of longer term vision, doesn't it? Like, what do we as a country actually want to be recognised for and known for? And where do we want to, what direction do we want to push the economy in? Just on mycelium quickly, we were actually also using it on a project called Catchment to Coast, which is a large government flood scheme. And what we're doing with that project is looking at literally like what happens in the upper catchment of a site down to the coast and what's the story of the water all the way through that.
Yeah.
But they're looking at using mycelium impregnated into leaky dams and with, I'm not sure of the exact product because we're only just starting to look at it, but where they're basically using rolls and pieces of it because it's got huge water attenuation capacity.
Yeah.
So it's really effective in the upper catchments for impregnating and rolling out as part of leaky dams and things to hold back huge amounts of floodwaters. So you can make those already nature-based solutions even more resilient and have a much greater capacity for water management.
And it comes down to something that I was going to mention earlier around risk, and you sort of brought it up, around the risk of investing now and the risk of doing this now. There is and this happens on construction, engineering, and architecture projects all the time. You will find some fantastic, phenomenal energy and products and innovations that are really trying to push through. But then you'll have a really heavy middle. And the middle will be people who tend to just have a lot of pressure in the job, who need to deliver a scheme really quickly. Otherwise, there's budgetary constraints that might disappear. Particularly local authorities and local government, you know, those budgets often come and go very quickly within a cycle. But sustainability is often seen as a bit of an add-on and therefore is seen as a bit of a risk in terms of the project. The issue I've got with that is that those people in that heavy middle is often gloriously unaware that most of the private finance behind this has some phenomenal ESG targets that need to be met and objectives. So, you know, you could be working on a building, you could be talking to the client on the building about its sustainability credentials. The client's sort of saying, well, you know, we'd like to do this, and it's not happening. And everyone's like, yeah, no, there's a big risk to the project if we do that. In reality, over time and definitely coming down the line, it's going to be an even bigger risk to the funding just being totally withdrawn on the project, because the big insurers, the big pension funds, they're not getting their ESG criteria met.
Yeah.
So that, for me, that is there needs to be transparency all the way down the chain that says the real money behind this project has these environmental commitments.
Yeah.
And they need to drive all of your decision making. And people go, oh, well, that is what happens. Well, it's kind of not what happens, because there's objectives, there's a brief that's developed, there's another sort of version of that brief that's developed. And by the time it gets down to the actual project, there's a very good chance that the people working on the actual project might not even know who the background investors are in the project, or where the big money for that project's coming from, because it won't be the local authority or the local government. It'll be a private fund somewhere.
Yeah, that's true. No, I think you're right there, and that's something I'm observing as well. Is that those people are starting to leverage that and use it as a way of moving forward. But I have to say, a lot of the ESG stuff I've also seen, I think a lot of it really still misses the mark. You know, I was reading one recently, which I think you'll appreciate because it's on air quality, and the requirement for ESG was to carry out an air quality assessment. That was it, and that was the only requirement to achieve the ESG standard. And I thought, well,
Yeah.
okay, that's the start.
What do you do? What do you do?
What do you do with that information? Exactly. Like, surely there should be some other way of monitoring the solutions or whatever's done as part of the criteria, but it wasn't. So, you know, I think there's also a big opportunity for engineers, architects, and other specialists that are actually on the front line dealing with this, getting way more involved with ESG policy, because at the moment a lot of it is written by people that don't necessarily get involved in the like day-to-day side of actually tackling these problems, and that leaves a big vulnerability in the system, or it's done in a way where it isn't measurable. So the actual benefits and outcomes are not as clear as they should be. And this is something, again, I'm seeing in a lot of projects now that we're involved with, where actually
it's understanding what that impact is, isn't it? You know, it's not like exactly like you say, it's don't tell me how dirty or how clean the air is, but tell me if we fix it, what will be the avoided cost to the local NHS system?
Absolutely, yeah. Start quantifying it. And the thing is as well, it doesn't always, you know, you can't do everything. There are always trade-offs. You know, so for instance, on the water side, we have lots of targets for developments on like quantity of water used. But you can't on all developments get to those lower levels. It's just potentially not possible because of the type of development or some of the use that it's being used for or whatever, or there may be financial restrictions where actually you can't go as far as you want to go or you need to go because there's some other thing that has to be dealt with. So all of those things need to be factored in, but if there's not the clear sort of guidelines or targets in place that are measurable, because again, sometimes they're just not there, or they're really, you know, they're not as anywhere near as hard-nosed as perhaps they should be, or forward-thinking as they should be, because they do need to be forward-thinking to drive the innovation. And then, as you say, once people have done it for a while, it becomes the norm. It's easy, but we're at this point where we've got to get over that hurdle and make it the standard.
I'm always reminded of sort of two theories here that come back from the days when I was studying and doing my doctorate. One of them is that we will always take the path of least resistance, and that's a bit of a challenge in terms of trying to do the right thing. So how do you combat humans always wanting to take the path of least resistance? Because, you know, a good one for me here is nutrient neutrality, and the fact that everyone's kicking, this is the reason why we can't build houses. This is the reason. It's not the reason why we can't build houses. The reason why we can't build houses is because you're failing to tackle the problem head on and come up with a solution. You're looking for the path of least resistance, that is, how can I make an excuse to not do this, or to argue against it, lobby against it, and try to destroy it as something that we have to achieve.
Absolutely. And the thing is as well, with nutrient, it's a really good example, because fundamentally, we're not looking at it strategically. You're looking at it in as it's always been, where it's something that we bolt onto the end. We'll just pay for some sewage treatment works to go in. That'll solve the problem. Well, one, it's not economically viable for smaller developments. And two, is it really the best solution? Whereas actually we should be going, right, how do we approach the design of the settlement to design out the problem to begin with? And then you make a much more resilient settlement. It's probably cheaper for the people that are going to live there in the long run because their bills are all reduced. I mean, we're doing a huge amount of work on water neutrality and nutrient neutrality. And, you know, we've got technologies that can reduce water use in households by down to about a third of what the average is in the UK. That's a huge reduction. So that's a reduction in energy cost and water costs for residents. But it's also dealing with that problem of nutrient neutrality.
Well, and if, you know, so you go back to that question of how do we address the problem of the path of least resistance in everybody? Well, the only thing that I've found and that I think to work, you know, so my earlier studies were all in human experience and how we make decisions and how we go about that. And there's something called metabolic theory, which is that you will make decisions based on the level of how hard you perceive the activity to be. So if you're faced with, it could be an optical illusion of a ramp, of a steeper gradient but a shorter climb, or a longer gradient but a more gentle climb over a longer period, you'll always select the one that you feel is going to use the least metabolic energy. You know, it's almost innate in us from a survival perspective to conserve calories, to conserve that energy that we're going to expend reaching the goal or understanding how we get from A to B. The challenge that we've got now is that I don't think we are educating the public, we are educating ourselves enough to understand that actually it's not a metabolic equation from here to there in a really short distance. It's, which we might say, do you know what, it's really easy for us to not have nutrient neutrality, so let's not have it.
Yeah.
What we're not really taking account of is, if we don't do that, there's going to be a number of other fundamental consequences that are going to mean you are going to have to expend a hell of a lot more energy over your lifetime, cost and bodily energy, to get to where you want to go over the longer period. And you can apply the same principle of metabolic theory to individuals, to organizations, to businesses. And for me, that's what's fueling our short-termism is, well, how much is it going to cost to get from A to B? And I'm, well, how much is it going to cost to get from A to net zero? So that's what we really want to push people to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, again, on the nutrient neutrality side of things, it's also from the perspective of, it doesn't need to cost more. It just needs to be done in the process needs to be done the right way. So thinking about it that way, you can really massively, again, okay, you might not be able to deal with the whole problem, but you're able to significantly then reduce whatever that quantum is that you have left to deal with. And that is also the way I think that we need to sort of reevaluate the way we've been doing things. Yes, it does mean we're going to have to start rethinking the way we approach infrastructure and building. But is that a bad thing? And actually, what are the other knock-ons of that? Because actually, we think it's going to be cheaper long term to do it this way, because you've got so many less upgrades and all these other things that are happening. And that's something that's not, you know, it's not always factored in.
And become more comfortable with change. You know, there's some amazing products out there. There's some phenomenal new materials. I mean, the advanced materials space is exploding at the moment. You know, I regularly get locked in discussions and debates with people around concrete. I'm not worried about concrete at all. I have zero worries about concrete, because there are so many phenomenal startups that are now starting to get certification and coming to market around replacing the cementitious content of concrete using sustainable processes, around replacing lightweight aggregates using sustainable processes that are actually circular as well and use waste plastics. So I have no concerns about concrete. I have very little concerns about steel. The UK is not in a great place with steel because most of our furnaces are blast furnaces and there's only one electric arc furnace. So we need a wider industry plan about how do we transition that and how do we make that work. But there's some phenomenal work coming out of Celsa Steel, who are based in Cardiff, looking at going to site, helping to reclaim the steel and repurpose that steel, or remanufacture that steel into new steel, and therefore giving you a much lower carbon steel. And steel and concrete are two of our biggest challenges within the construction engineering space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, there's this a very dim view of things like concrete, but actually it's such a fantastic material. It sometimes is by far the best choice to have something like that because it is so resilient.
Yeah, one of the big things I had a discussion with somebody recently about was, we tend to do a life cycle analysis or whole life carbon analysis of products over a 30-year or 60-year period. I still can't really find the answer as to why it's a 30-year or a 60-year period, other than, well, that's the way we've always done it. Because in reality, we could put up a really resilient concrete frame using low carbon or carbon neutral concrete, and that frame could last 200 years. So it fundamentally changes all of the mathematics around the problem, because the people who were then saying, well, concrete's incredibly high carbon solution for doing that. Well, it might be over 60 years or over 30 years, but what's the lifespan of the building that you're proposing? Because if it's only 30 years, this frame could be here for another 70, another 170 years in comparison to the original building that you put on the ground. So it's that wider appreciation over a much, much longer term vision that I think that we really need to start to grapple with. We need to get our data scientists involved with. We need to start looking at our future climate models, at sort of our increase in temperature, our surface water management, our flooding, and open everybody's eyes to it. I listened to a fantastic talk the other day by the chief meteorologist at the Met Office, and the level of understanding of how our climate is changing and what's happening to it. It's not something we're talking about publicly. It's not a conversation we're having.
Absolutely. I heard a terrifying statistic the other day from a water company, no less. So they should know better than anyone. But they were saying that the southeast of England now has worse water availability than the Sahara. And you think, what? Hang on a minute, that's crazy. And they were like, yeah, well, actually, okay, when you think about it as an ecosystem, we've gone below the point where the ecosystem can be sustained, basically. So yes, there may be more water, but the availability of that water is actually worse than the availability of water in the Sahara. So we've now reached this critical point where everything is starting to collapse, basically.
It appears like we're reaching a lot of critical points at the moment.
Yeah, we are. Worryingly, we are. And I think the trouble is, it's happening a lot quicker than I think a lot of people realised. And I said this in a lot of the podcast episodes to people, that more and more people I meet are going, I'm actually thinking of changing my job now into something that addresses this. I met a lady just last week who was working as an air hostess and in some sort of infrastructure stuff as well on the side. And she sort of said to me, look, I don't really want to carry on this. I've identified that I want to do something as meaningful as I can, and this is the kind of thing I want to be involved with, tackling these problems. And a lot of my friends from school, I've used this example many times, who are mechanics or like manufacturing engineers or whatever, they are now mostly retraining into manufacturing of renewables or research into new technologies and new materials and all this kind of thing, because they said it's the future. One, it's the future of high-paying jobs, but also we need to do it because it's important.
I don't think there's any more meaningful or any more worthy subject to focus on at the moment. It's our greatest challenge. It's probably our greatest challenge as a human race, to be quite honest with you. Fixing the thing we broke. But in reality, it has to start as well. There's a fantastic thing in Brussels. I was talking to a lady the other day who was a spin out from a university in Brussels, and she runs a company that just helps SMEs. They're government funded. If an SME builder or construction company or architect engineer comes to us and says, I don't understand the latest standards in X, or we need to really get upskill on this company is just employed to hold their hand, to take them through the process, free of cost, free of charge, to bring on all of those SMEs, because construction's mainly SMEs.
About 2,500 SME builders
in that space. And, we talked about it before. The skills gap, the skills shortage in this space is phenomenal. So there's a whole piece that needs to be really, really focused nationally around not only where are the skills that we need to get to the next level, but also how are we dealing with, I really want to push how we're dealing with the next generation of people coming through the business. Because we haven't really touched on it, but the reason why I was attracted to Cundall and to come and join this business was exactly because of that, was exactly because of you saying, I had a bit of a sustainability midlife crisis. And you're like, look, I need to be doing something that is really on the front line, the cutting edge of guidance, of advice, of working with governments, and about how do we change this and how do we make it better. And the tipping point and the decision point for me was that, Cundall have come out and said they've got this net zero design campaign, and it's a net zero design 2030. And they're fundamentally not going to work on projects that aren't net zero design after 2030. So we're now going through this huge piece of working with clients and talking to clients about this transition that actually, if the projects aren't going to be net zero design, then we've committed to not working on them after 2030. So there's some phenomenal information about that on the website. But that was one of the things that really drove me to think, do you know what, these guys are taking this really seriously. That's the kind of place that I need to be in terms of advising people and the people who are setting out their stall for all of the next business models, all of the next big challenges that governments and businesses are going to face.
No, I absolutely agree. I think that's the way forward for a lot of people, and it's also why I set my business up. I wanted the freedom of having my own business to be able to go and engage with a lot of what was happening and make sure things are being done perhaps the way that I think they should be being done. And the reason we set the podcast up is because I was meeting all these amazing people doing that stuff, and I found that actually even I just never really heard about a lot of it, so we wanted to try and share that message. So I think there's a huge appetite for people to sort of get more involved. One of the big issues we've got with addressing all of these issues that we've talked about is, as you already sort of mentioned, the fact that there just isn't really enough professionals to actually deliver what we're trying to do. So we've got to try and bring more people in. And this applies to everything from engineering to architecture to landscape, ecology, farming, forestry, the list goes on and on and on. And there's a lot of emerging things too in terms of new technologies and stuff that need to be researched and developed which are completely new and interesting fields, like the algae side that we mentioned, the mycelium. They're completely new things that have never really been done significantly before now. So there's a great opportunity to start looking at that. But there is kind of a fundamental problem, I think, in the way that we are bringing people into the professions and sort of talking about the professions and what we all do.
I totally agree. I think it's twofold. There's not enough people, and then it's also trying to reskill people that are maybe ingrained in the role that they've got into a new emerging role. I think our industry has never been so siloed, so ingrained in doing things the way that it wants to do things. And really, if you're going to be slightly cynical, but possibly fair, slightly authoritic in the way that it goes about adopting new technologies, construction as an industry has often been quite slow to adopt. However, what does buck that trend is if something is properly certified and other people are using it to gain a competitive or commercial advantage, and there's also an economic case for it, it tends to be adopted incredibly quickly. So there's definitely that economic piece that needs to be done, but it's the breaking down of those silos for me that is massive with regards to the construction industry. And that's kind of part of the reason why, we first started talking about podcasts. We run a podcast called Future X with Martin Hearn from Future Build. And the whole point of the Future X podcast is that we are trying to find people from outside of the sector who we should be listening to. And you could probably level the criticism at architects most, to be honest, as a profession. And having gone through it and having taught over 1,000 architects, architecture is one of the most self-referential forums out there. The original RIBA charter pretty much focused on engaging with the wider arts and sciences. It was written in the charter that it was an architect's responsibility to engage with the wider arts and sciences. I think the profession lost that over time. We started to engage with each other a lot more. And actually, it's not just architects, but it's all of the construction sector. We're great at talking to each other about things. We're even better at talking to our own disciplines about things. What we need to do now is break down the walls and talk to all of the amazing scientists and psychologists and sociologists and neuroscientists and environmentalists and marine biologists about what's coming next, and can we give them a platform, and how do we help get that product and get those thinkers into our industry. An amazing statistic is that of all of the companies that have spun out of the deep green biotech hub, and there's over 800, there wasn't one construction-related company that span out of that. And there was loads of food and beverage, there was loads of fashion, there was loads of textile, but there wasn't one construction company. And I think that's primarily because we're a really difficult sector to navigate. If you're not part of the construction industry, you don't kind of understand how it works, how broken it is sometimes, and how to get things done and how to get things over the line, and just who to talk to and when to talk to them. It's a really intimidating environment to try to bring a new product to try to get something over the line. So one of the companies we sort of did a bit of work with was Natasha Boulding and the guys from Low Carbon Materials, who were Earthshot finalists last year. And we've had them on Future X. We've worked with them for a bit around how do you navigate the construction sector? How can we get your carbon negative blocks into the construction sector? How can we generate, and we talk probably every month now, well, what are the project opportunities? are there any pilot projects that we can put you forward for, or demonstrator projects? Just constantly trying to get this phenomenal product developed by people who have no construction experience at all. You know, they are chemists who've just found an incredible solution to making concrete blockwork, which exists by the millions in stadiums, in arena, and in many public buildings, carbon negative and carbon neutral. So that's the whole purpose of our podcast, which is to look at how do we create a platform for innovators and disruptors, and how do we build a bit of a community, exactly like you guys are doing, which is phenomenal. And we totally need to have you on in return and have a chat about all the amazing projects you're doing, because I haven't done anything but talk at you.
No, that's what it's about. And I think, you know, my view with doing this podcast was always, you know, yes, I'm doing stuff, but actually, you know, I want to find out what other people are doing. Yeah. And luckily, I kept bumping into and meeting a lot of these amazing people, and thought, actually, why don't you guys come on and talk about what you're doing, and I'll just try and sit here as quietly as I can and sort of facilitate that. So I'd love to come on and talk a bit about sort of what I'm involved with as well, because I talk a bit about it sometimes, but
no, we need a full episode on this.
But yeah, there's just a lot of amazing things going on. But I think for me, one of the big worrying things is around how our professions adapt to this changing sort of scenario that we're in. Because one of my big worries, and also partly why I went out doing a lot of stuff on my own and building my own sort of ventures and partnering with people, was because I don't think that like the traditional ways of doing stuff really are that viable anymore. I think a lot of the professions are stuck in this kind of system where they're not forward thinking enough, or it's not even forward thinking, they're not thinking broadly enough, as you said, to incorporate these problems. Now, I use the Landscape Institute as an example here. I'm not by any way speaking on their behalf, but I used to be a trustee and things for them. And they actually did quite a good job, because originally I was very skeptical, because my background before I did landscape and urban design and stuff was forestry, conservation, did a bit of farming, that kind of thing. And then I did the urban design after. And none of that, apart from my degree, which was in landscape, was landscapey enough for the Landscape Institute, which I think is complete
madness.
Well, okay, it's a much politer word than I was going to say. You cut me off perfectly there, well timed. And we can have you to dub all of our episodes, that'd be great. But I just thought it was absolutely, madness. My view of landscape architecture is maybe slightly different. Yeah. And it's that really the role of landscape architects is to articulate the narrative of other professionals and what they're doing. A bit like what you said within the RIBA Charter. Yeah. And I think that role traditionally sat with architects, but has perhaps moved, as you said, a little bit away from that now. Yeah. But it's absolutely becoming something much more in the realms of what landscape architects do.
Look, I totally agree. It shouldn't sit with architects. It shouldn't sit with architects. Architects are trained even less in how to deal with the external landscape. In fact, they're not trained at all in how to deal.
Well, it's not even the external landscape as such. It's kind of the landscape as in landscape scale thinking. Yeah. That's what it should be, in my view. But yes, there's some paving and trees and stuff that can go in, but it's beyond that, really.
I mean, we've touched on this before in some of our conversations, but don't you think that there's a huge missed opportunity in landscape architecture, which I think there needs to, and I think there is a bit of a reawakening and a revolution happening in this space. But we need to be, in my mind, nobody should be putting a tree in a box in a city centre. Nobody should be putting a tree in a planter. You know, there's a time and a place for it, depending on ground conditions. But in reality, that tree in the ground is going to contribute, is going to grow better, be healthier, and contribute far much more to flood mitigation and mitigating the heat island effect over the next 20, 30 years, if it's in the ground. If it's in a box, it's a maintenance issue, nightmare, and it's not doing the things that it needs to do for you. You're investing the same amount of time almost at the beginning in getting it there, but it's not doing the things that you need it to do over the next 20, 30 years to make that city more inhabitable. Last week, when it was mid-30s, I was walking down the street in London looking for tree shade. That was literally, the journey was a long straight line, and I was running between trees just to stay under the shade, because that was only where it's comfortable. That's going to become commonplace. So what are we doing now? What is the big plan for all of our cities to not just nominate themselves as great big parks of the future?
Indeed. But then, how's it going to work? And what's the bigger objective? London's a national park city, and what? Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm looking at these things going, and like, okay, London actually has a very good policy, the urban greening factor, which is really going to help green the city massively. Yeah. That's good. That's really, and a lot of other cities are looking at rolling that out too. Absolutely, 100% they should do. It's going to be way more impactful than BNG. Biodiversity net gain is going to have a negligible impact on cities. Mm-hmm. It's just not going to have the impact people think it is.
Yeah.
Urban greening factor, massive impact. Yeah. That's what they're the sort of policies and things we should be looking at and supporting. But, talking about landscape, for me, it's a lot about principles. So, for instance, we've just submitted plans for a new development that we've been working on. It's 800 homes and a big sports provision in Sussex. It's the first large-scale development that's water neutral that I've ever heard of. Yeah. There were master planners involved that we worked with very closely, obviously infrastructure teams and everything else, but there wasn't an architect involved in the project at all. And it's not the landscape that people traditionally perhaps would think about. Yeah, sure, there's parks and stuff and some green corridors, but that's all going to be fixed later. It's not really that important. It's important to tick some boxes, but the detail of that's not important now. What's important is to go, right, what are the principles of this? Broadly, how's it going to function and what is the purpose of its function? So it's looking at the green corridors. How are they multifunctional? Yeah. How are they going to manage water? How are people going to use them to get around the space? How is that going to form the backbone of the infrastructure strategy for the development? Yeah. They're the things that we need to be thinking about at a high level. The detail of them can be resolved later, but if those principles are not right from the beginning, we're missing the opportunities for projects. And that's the way we need to be looking at projects wherever they are, whether they're in an urban setting or rural setting or whatever. And it's making sure that stuff is planned as effectively as possible from the beginning. So it's an embedded strategic solution.
But that's a level of education that currently I don't think exists. So it's learned, it's lived experience, it's enthusiasm, it's passion, it's understanding, the fact that you've got this history where you understand all of these elements to it. Yes, we've got people that are fantastic at master planning and that understand these more complex systems that need to be overlaid onto cities. But how is that then working its way back down into our universities and our educational system?
Well, it isn't.
And that's the challenge, because the way UK universities are set up, they predominantly focus and this is from my lived experience, on research. And on impact and a fairly prosaic self-referential system of research and impact funding. Now, a lot of that needs to change with regards to sustainability, because what you really want in a university teaching team is practitioners, is people who are on the front line trying to design nature-based design interventions and climate interventions and solutions real life on a project. And that's where I think we've got a huge gap that we need to traverse in terms of our university educational system and the power, the energy and the power and the intellectual power that belongs there, in saying, well, look, we have these real problems here right now. How can we bring practitioners over and bring academics and students over and do something that's really project-based learning, but not in the university environment, in the real world?
Yeah.
Because we don't have the time to wait for all of these people who are in industry to decide that maybe they want to be a professor or something later on in life. And
100% agree, because the thing is as well, it's not equipping people at the moment. There's a fundamental problem that universities are not equipping people to actually do the jobs that they're graduating from. And, I hear this all the time. I've heard people that are presidents of, I'll say this, a bit careful what I say, but I've heard people that are presidents of professions tell me they'll no longer hire graduates in their profession because they just don't think they're well equipped enough to do the job. They'd rather hire them from an alternative profession that has an alternative way of thinking or better work ethic, and then train them themselves. And this is something I'm hearing more and more from people. So universities have also got this big challenge of thinking, what is our role and how are we going to start delivering people at the speed that we need to get people out to actually address these problems. They've got to have a fundamental rethink in how the courses are structured and how they're approached. And I think it has to be like private sector led in a sense in terms of the learning and the real world application. Because the other thing is, in a way it tends to be more, whilst obviously they're doing the research which is cutting edge, it's often very niche. And what we kind of need is that rough, complicated series of solutions that have to come together and see those points where it breaks down to be able to create innovation and interconnected solutions.
There's such a broken culture within the university system at the moment, because the way the government set the funding mechanisms up for research, they've got something called the Research Excellence Framework. It may have changed name by now, but it's exactly the same thing in essence. You compete in a research Olympics every 4 years to say who is the best at research. Now, and there's certain funding mechanisms and there's a certain amount of cash that gets drawn down to the university based on that. And it's the government that sets that agenda. Now, the unintended consequence of that is that university programs will often just hire increasingly obscure, niche, well-published, because they publish to their own group in their own peer-reviewed journals, academics to deliver a project. But also, it doesn't support collaboration. I can say this from first hand. There's no prizes for collaborating. When you're at a university, there's no prizes for collaborating with somebody else at the same university. There's sometimes a concession if they're in a slightly different department or discipline. But if they're in the same school or area, you are much better off collaborating with somebody at another university. Now, that's a positive. But it's an absurd rule that you can't build a crack squad, a great team, a lab in the true academic, collaborative, collegiate sense at some of our best institutions, because there's far too much individual pride and ownership over an area of study or an area of research, and too much protectionism in that sense. That we need to get back towards that genuine collaboration, but in action on projects, exactly as you said.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I remember I was in Costa Rica and I visited a university, I can't remember what it's called, but I visited a university there. And I was really impressed by the way that they handled some of their projects. And it's a bit how my college did it when I did forestry. It was treated like a job more than it was college, because we were outside cutting trees down and we had to extract them and process them and everything. Much more hands-on. But this university had architecture, engineering, landscape, it had project management, it had forestry, all of these things. And they had to build a building by the end of the year. So they had to develop, the architects had to develop the plans, they had to work with the engineers to figure out the structural loadings. And then at the end of the year, they built something. So they had to then work with the foresters to make sure that it was sustainably managed and understand the processes and everything that went through the whole process of building a structure. And that collaboration let them learn, that's a problem they've got. This is a waste product. And you start thinking very differently about how to come up with solutions, and you build a connection then that also builds you up for your future working career, because engineers, foresters, all these people that are going to be much more beneficial than knowing a bunch of other architects or landscape architects when you leave university.
And that project-based learning is so powerful to the way that you go about understanding your profession. I think what I'd love to see happen is you widen it out a bit. You take that classroom to a project. And say, actually, this is a real world challenge that we're having right now, and we'd love your academics to sharpen their tools and say, how do we fix it? But what tends to happen at the moment quite often is that yes, you'll come across some great labs and some great groups. We're working with some phenomenal people at the National Green Infrastructure Facility, working with people looking at extreme weather at Newcastle University as well. The Hub for Biotechnology in the Built Environment in the North East. There's some phenomenal groups of people that are doing really, really great work with industry. But en masse, if you look at all of the intellectual might and power that exists across the UK university network, you can't help but feel like we're missing a trick in addressing our massive, huge problem on the horizon, which is just how do we do this and how do we watch out for all of those unintended consequences?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I don't know if you wanted to touch any more on sort of advanced materials and what kind of research and stuff you're seeing come from that, and how your podcast is, well, maybe some examples from the podcast to people that are coming in as well on that front.
Yeah, could do that. Do you want to tease off on some of the exciting things that are coming that we're seeing, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe if you can, maybe explain some of the new things that you've seen coming and some of your observations, because I think you guys are doing such interesting stuff there. I mean, you've already talked about some of it, but
yeah, I think
it'd be good to know a bit more. I'm just conscious of time.
I think one of the best things about the podcast is that the reason why it started, apart from Future Build and Martin Hearn being so proactive in getting it off the ground, was that during lockdown I made a list of just at the risk of going incredibly insane with nothing to do other than garden and make sandwiches, was make a list of some of the most amazing people that I just wanted to speak to that weren't architects. So economists, world-leading international economists, neuroscientists, physicists, marine biologists, all the people I've been talking about. And I just threw out an invite and just said, look, I know you're doing nothing right now. Do you want to have a chat? And almost all of them came back and said, yeah, right. And I said, oh, well, would you mind if we sort of record it and we might use it in a podcast later? And again, almost all of them said, yeah, it's fine, whatever. I'm just glad to talk to somebody about some interesting stuff. So that was such a really enlightening, really transformational time for me, to be quite honest, in being able to just reach out and genuinely collaborate worldwide with so many people who just weren't busy and weren't caught up in the tyranny of the present. I spoke to, and most of them tended to be authors of great books, because that's where I started. I go, that Charles Montgomery's written a fantastic book called Happy City. I wonder if he wants to have a chat. Why would he want to have a chat with me? And you should reach out to Charles, and Charles is staying at his mother's house, and during lockdown to look after them, and he's sort of dialing in on this connection, and we're just having a great conversation about how do you create socially more inclusive, happier environments and cities. But the materials bit was really sort of the next evolution of that, and that's where Future X and the podcast with Future Build really came into it. We've talked to some, as I've said, some phenomenal concrete companies, low carbon materials, Ceratec, who have developed a cementitious replacement. We've talked to some really great low carbon energy solutions, so the zero emissions boiler with Tepio, and Sunamp, who've got a fantastic phase change material, water heater and storage system. There's all of these amazing technologies on the horizon. I am always blown away by when we reach out and talk to people about them. The microalgae and the bioreactors in buildings was another one with the University of Technology Sydney and Peter Ralph there. So the whole point of the podcast is just to reach out to these fantastic advanced material startups, sustainable startups, and try to give them a platform, but also try to connect them with other people who are doing great work.
Yeah.
The best bit of it, actually, which isn't filmed and we often joke should be recorded, is every now and again we'll throw together a London meetup with some of the companies, and we'll just do a get together in a London pub. And I took the guy Peter Ralph from Sydney and the biotech lab there. We had the guys from Mycore who haven't been on the podcast yet, but are due to, who are two phenomenal young women working in the mycelium space. And then Thermulon, who are doing some great work in making aerogels, nanoporous aerogels, affordable when they're super high insulating and often only used in space. You just throw all these people around the table together and just say, all right, how are we going to mix this up? Because you don't have all of the horrendous, protracted IP, and I mean, of course you do, but it's a lot more. There's a lot more energy. There's a lot more. There's a truer spirit of collaboration.
Yeah. Because
you can look people in the eye. You're not going to get your ideas stolen, and actually you're with like-minded people who can say, do you know what? You should try this biopolymer that I've made in Sydney in your in the construction of your aerogel boards. Great, God, I would never have thought that. Fantastic, or the aerogel guys saying, well, maybe we could put our aerogels in your mycelium blocks and it would massively increase the thermal performance of the block. Yes, it would. Great idea. But
absolutely,
that kind of collaboration doesn't usually exist when you get further and further and further down the line in product development and growing a business. So that's the really exciting bit for me, is that often the conversations with all these game changers and innovators that happen on the podcast tend to happen in environments. And we have talked about taking it on the road and visiting city by city and just throwing it out there and saying, look, if you've got a great idea, just come along and let's talk about it, and we'll try and get it into the system, into the sector, because we need to do things differently.
Yeah, absolutely, we do. And I think those things are always surprisingly beneficial. I mean, the way we met the guys from Mexico was on a UK Innovate mission to Brazil that we went on recently. And that was surprising because we didn't expect... Well, it's a very convoluted story. I'll tell you another time. But we didn't expect to meet them.
Tell us on the podcast.
I'll tell you on the podcast. Yeah, exactly. That was where you got to tune to their podcast to catch that. So that was a very interesting sort of outcome that we didn't expect from this Innovate mission, because we were thinking to meet people in Brazil and we met people from Mexico and all of this kind of thing. It's a bit obscure, but there was another very interesting example, same kind of thing we had in Singapore, which I was just 2 weeks ago, and we were obviously there talking about water resilience, but then there was a gentleman there who we'd met before called Nigel Cassidy, a professor, and he's developing technologies that can heat and cool from water and from the ground. And we were like, that's really interesting, because maybe we can use some of where we store the water could be used for the heating and blah, blah, blah. And then there was another guy there who was dealing with this paint that reflects heat away from the buildings. And we sort of didn't dismiss it, but we were like, okay, yeah, it's not really so relevant. And then it turned out actually that the scale of what they were trying to do, and one of the big issues was the heat being released into the city. And we were sort of going, well, actually, what if we had water in front of the paint to take the heat away, and then that heat can be used to generate energy and all this kind of thing. And you start thinking, actually, there's some really fantastic research opportunities and new technologies that could come out of, that combined thinking of things you otherwise would never really have considered. And those opportunities are really, fantastic and really exciting ones as well.
And it goes to, how do we take it to the masses, though? So the other one is, Cundall have got a phenomenal growing expertise and relationship with data centers and delivering data centers. Now, there's different ways to deliver a data center, but what typically happens is data centers aren't around urban centers. They're often on the edge of urban centers and they're slightly out of the mix. But we've also got an amazing relationship with district heat networks. And thinking about how can we start to develop a district heat network. Well, it just so happens that data centers produce an awful lot of heat. So, and Deep Green, I think they're called, are a fantastic company who have managed to put a data center into their own proprietary system to heat a community swimming pool for free. Why aren't we making those kind of collaborations all the time? Well, if we're thinking about the planning of our cities and of our neighborhoods, then why not decentralize the data center? Yeah, there's a little bit more cost in it, but actually the social impact and the economic value that you're getting from that additional social impact is huge for the business. Why don't we take that data center from the outskirts and start to move it towards these urban centers where it might hook up to a district heat network, and we can start to use that data center to generate that heat. I've said it once and I'll say it again, probably until I die. I don't think there is a more exciting space to be than the construction sector at the moment. I think it is an unbelievable space for innovation. I think we're at the vanguard of trying to address the climate emergency on every level. We are the authors, rightly or wrongly, with the communities of the spaces that we live in, that we work in, that we play in, that we travel through. And it's incumbent upon us to get this right. Otherwise, we're not going to hit our climate targets.
No, absolutely. I think that is a fantastic way to summarize the conversation and the opportunities that are out there for all of us to kind of reach out and grasp, and to help encourage people into these sectors and these professions to help really tackle these problems head on and innovate. There's such a big opportunity for innovation that I think people don't always see when they sort of look at this sector as well. And I think that's a great point to finish on. So thank you so much for your time and having us here.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you're going to have to pay us back by coming on the podcast anyway.
I'll be more than happy to. More than happy to. But brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, and look forward to catching up with you soon on your podcast.
Cheers, mate.
Thanks. It's important to remember that sustainability doesn't just relate to the environment, it relates to your finances as well. That's why we switched to Beans Accountants. Beans operate on a package system, so you always know where you stand. We halved our accountancy costs when we moved to them, and one of our associates moved to them as well and reduced theirs by 2/3. With free tax advice, accountancy support, and everything else they offer, you can't go wrong. So make sure you check out Beans Accountants in the description below, and I really hope you enjoy this episode. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you're interested in finding out more about what Cundall do, then make sure to check out their website. And if you want to find out more and keep track of Ollie's work, then check out his podcast and make sure to follow him across social media. His podcast is the Future X podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, most importantly to this podcast, of course. And a huge thank you to the sponsors that have made this podcast possible. So Marshalls, Water Offsets, and Vectorworks are our fantastic sponsors. We're supported by Gillian Goodson Design and the Birmingham Botanical Gardens. And of course, we're powered by NDLA and Monsterdon. So a huge thank you again for Dr. Ollie for his time, and see you again soon.